Hey, welcome back to Technical Writing Uncensored. I'm here with Delfina Hotcha, founder of Little Language Models. She's an information architect who lives in Austria. Welcome to Technical Writing Uncensored.
Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Great to see you again. And
Yeah.
thanks for that emphasis, like little language models. Yes, you heard it right.
Yeah. Well, I've been on a rant about how AI is really large language models, so it is kind of timely for me. But what does a professional information architect do?
Yes. So, an information architect is focused on the process of structuring information. So, that might sound like a lot of the work that technical writers do, or content designers do, content strategists do. Information architects specifically are more focused on the navigation aspect of the information. So, specifically for digital products like websites or apps, kind of like making sure that the navigation of the website is aligned with business goals and user goals and using language that matches what users would expect. And
Mm-hmm.
then for apps specifically, it's also understanding a little bit more about information hierarchy and how users search for information and how they're looking for things when they are interacting with an app or SaaS platform. So ensuring that some of those guidelines about information architecture, like what goes first, what do we say next, are kind of included in the product experience and helping elevate it rather than like leave it behind or create issues between internal teams with like design and engineering, or creating issues with users and customers and kind of like affecting negatively some of those metrics that we care about with retention or churn or just conversions.
Mm-hmm. How did you get into this as a profession?
Uh, well, at the start of my career, I really took to heart this advice about like saying yes to as many things as possible. So at the start of my career, I started with writing, and I was doing kind of like everything that you can think of as related to writing in a professional context. So both long form and then short form for email newsletters, social media. I was doing a lot of testing for push notifications, and I was working with a bunch of startups at the beginning of my career, which really helped with getting experience with different things. And I was able to kind of like understand where both my interests were and then my skill sets were, and then of course the market needs as well. And that's kind of like how I decided to specialize in information architecture specifically. So this part that I saw kind of like as a not necessarily a lack in the market, because it has been around as a field for many years now, but something that I personally wanted to focus on. And then companies I saw um, could understand the impact of this work and like making sure that like the structure is set up correctly from a content perspective. So by saying yes all of those initial few times, then I got roles that were like more focused on specifically navigation, taxonomy design, content modeling, information architecture. And then last year now, I decided to start my own thing. And then I have been doing this on my own since January last year. So working with clients directly on information architecture projects. And yeah, that has been an interesting, interesting journey so far, one that I've been really enjoying with its ups and downs for sure.
Mm-hmm. Why little language models?
Um, well, related to what I said earlier about like that structure component. So what I was seeing was that in a lot of projects, and this is also like backed up by psychology, which is my initial like what I studied and what I specialized in, and it was kind of like a lot of how I think about these projects as well, is that as people we have this like tendency to add when we encounter a problem rather than subtract or like remove. And this is something that I saw and still see quite a lot in digital projects. So there's this tendency to want to add more content to explain something, or like to add a feature to get more users or customers. And there's just always this tendency to add and add, whether that's words or adding other pages to navigation or other explanations. And I found that kind of like in many cases the opposite is what's needed. So you need this like digital minimalism within the product where
Mhm.
you have clarity on what like the actual key user needs are, like how those tie to the business goals, and then you make sure that those are addressed and kind of like other things are on top, but you're not relying on just adding and that every team kind of like has their own political inclination to include things in a page within a product or a website. And I saw that that was a bit of an issue. And then with large language models and AI, separate things, good call out. Um, I wanted the name to kind of like reflect the philosophy of my business, that I'm like focused on the structural components of the work and not adding without just really thinking through kind of like why are we adding? Is it necessary? What is adding to the product or user experience? If it's adding anything, in a lot of cases it's not, and kind of like there needs to be a rework of the way that we think about content within the product experience, whether that's like a docs site or marketing site or a consumer app, and just we need to rethink about what's added. And whenever possible, I'm also quite a bit of a big fan of reducing like cognitive load for users, and I think that's a big part that I'm personally very invested in, to kind of like make sure that whenever they are using a product that I have worked on, I want to make sure as much as it's within my power or control, let's say, to make sure that they're having a smooth experience. They're not necessarily thinking about the content or the words or where things are, but they're having an as smooth as possible experience. And I think this translates well also to more technical products, because generally there's these questions that I get with clients about like very technical domains and whether they kind of like warrant the same type of philosophy. And for me, they do. And I think that we need to kind of like treat users of these platforms that are very technical and very complex or deep, kind of like with the same respect, I would say, for their time and energy and cognitive load as we do all users, or as we should, in my perspective.
What's interesting to me is that for at least the senior level and above technical writers, we consider information architecture part of the job. But when we talk about information architecture, we're talking about specifically how documentation is structured. And it seems like your view of information architecture is a bit more expansive and nuanced. Could you talk to me about that?
Thank you for calling my view nuanced. Um, I would say that since my focus has been information architecture, I have not been as focused, let's say, on what the platform specifically is. So, kind of like as you pointed, I've been working both with websites and apps, and then docs platforms, and then just more type of internet platforms as well. So, kind of like things that only the employees of a company are seeing, and then SaaS platforms that are behind a logged in view, and they have kind of like their own um, strategies that you need to keep in mind as you're designing for them and writing the content or rewriting an experience or recreating an experience, because they're not necessarily, like I said, writing something, but kind of like rethinking how the content is organized and structured and what you're saying and what you're not. It has been great to be in spaces like the Write the Dogs community that we talked about, and where we also met, where I'm meeting and getting like these perspectives from people that do maybe similar work, or they are within like this information sphere, but they have a completely different focus, and to kind of like learn from you all, and then learn how you are speaking about your work, where you're focusing on, and seeing like kind of the differences and trying to bridge those gaps and kind of like make the work together, both in the client's perspective and then also just for my own better understanding of kind of like how I can help you do your job, and not just you, but also product designers is a big part of the day-to-day people that I work with on my projects, or engineers as well. So I try to be in those spaces where those people hang out, to kind of like understand what they're struggling with, if they have worked like with information architects before, what that collaboration has been like, they likely have worked with someone who was like in charge of organizing the information, but not necessarily someone that had like the role information architect or something similar. And yeah, I always think it's good to kind of like get those perspectives from people that are in different fields, and it's how I've learned a lot of things that I wouldn't otherwise have, I think.
And so you do information architecture for websites and for docs and for applications. Or is there like more, is it all kind of the same concepts, or are there different kinds of information architecture and concerns for the different ways to apply it for the different
So with
contexts?
consumer apps, as you might, or apps specifically that are mobile apps, in this case, there's obviously some differences specifically with where you focus on and
Mhm.
kind of like how information architecture can be applied, because it is more on a granular level, I would say. So for information architecture for websites, it's kind of like the structure of the site and how pages are related to one another, how different types of content, so different content types are need to be connected to appear on the sites and the pages that the visitor is using. And then within the app, it's more about within a specific flow or screen, kind of like are the information architecture principles being applied as needed. So kind of like the way that I think about the main principles is findability. So like if a user is looking for something specific, can they find it, and can they find it easily, and like in how much time can they find it? So that's part of the work that I would do for an app. So kind of like reviewing if it's like the onboarding experience or like the checkout experience, if it's a e-commerce type of app, kind of like making sure that that findability aspect is incorporated, and whether it's, and if it's not, kind of like having those takeaways for the client, or like here's what you need to do to ensure that findability is improved and helping your users. The other two principles are value of the content. So something that I think about specifically in teams that do not have content experts is that the decisions are usually left to the designers or the engineers who may not have necessarily the desire to be involved, and then they are making like the best decision that they can within like the on top of their day job. So I totally understand that they do not necessarily have like the spoons in their mind to kind of like think through really what the
Yeah.
yeah um but that I think is a huge part of effective information architecture within an app. So kind of like if there have been these discussions, and discussions are a big part of like how I think of this process entirely, about what gets surfaced to the user. So sometimes again, like the inclination is just to put all the content that you have in the screen and kind of like let the user deal with it, which is not the best approach. So the best approach is to have those conversations early on. And if you have access and time to review like product analytics data, like Amplitude is a very good tool for that, to kind of like see what the potential issues might be where the users are dropping off, and then recreate that experience with like valuable content where you're seeing that if users are dropping off here, this is happening because we are not sharing valuable information that would make them better understand kind of like either prerequisites of what they need to do or what happens next. And then the third principle is timeliness. So kind of like related to the value aspect, but kind of like with whether you're showing too much or too little information. So again, I see companies do this quite a bit where sometimes they just do not, they miss critical information, and other times they're just putting everything, which kind of like again creates the issue of not knowing what is critical to the user. I remember then separately for Docs platform that I was trying to set up. They had like two components, like the software component and then the hardware component. And I had the hardware component and I was trying to set it up and I just could not get it to work. And I was like looking at the documentation, looking at everything and like asking. And then as it turns out, sometime after was that there was a specific type of a Wi-Fi connection that was needed to actually connect to this AI camera that I was trying to set up. And this was like nowhere mentioned in the
Oh,
documentation. But as you can
wow.
imagine, that can be a bit frustrating to users because also a lot of people do also now have like the 5 gigahertz connection, and then you're just like, what am I doing wrong? Because, and I think a lot of us have had these experiences where you're following the documentation step by step, but you just can't get it to work. And that's part of like making sure that you're the timeliness aspect, so you're showing it at the moment where users need to see it and not frustrating or confusing them or making feel like they're doing something wrong.
Yeah, heaven forbid you say, "Hey, it's easy to set up," and they're like, "No, it's not. Why is this not working?" When we spoke earlier, you had said that in your view there are two different kinds of information architecture.
Mhm.
Can you tell me about
Yes.
those?
So I I found it useful to differentiate the two just because kind of the type of projects that I work on and then the type of ways and goals that clients have differ in these two main ways. So the first one is what I call front-end information architecture, and the second one is what I call back-end information architecture. So the front-end aspect is kind of like the user-facing aspect of an information architecture. So if you're thinking about a website, you're thinking about the navigation specifically. So like the information, how it may be structured within a menu or how the pages are structured as the users see them. And then filters, for example, might be another part of like the front end facing information architecture. And that obviously include a lot of like the work with research, so like talking to users, understanding how they're specifically looking for information on the specific site or platform. And then backend information architecture is this aspect that's more related to um, the content modeling aspect of the work. So, kind of like these specific entities of content within a system, whether that's like a content management system, for example, how they relate to one another. And this usually looks like a diagram. And this diagram is not user facing in any moment, but it's internal facing. And one of its main purposes as a diagram is to kind of align everyone involved. A lot of the projects that I work on, there are like a lot of stakeholders from different teams, and some of them are involved in the project as it progresses, but some are not necessarily. And then this is like one of the checkpoints to ensure that we have all of the context about the different pieces of content and how they relate to one another. And so the diagram helps with a few things. So, like, first, the business stakeholders to kind of like understand specifically maybe like content management needs and if there are enough people on the team to actually ensure that we are making those updates that we need to make. And then engineering is a big component of that because I want engineering to be involved and to, of course, have a say on how things relate to one another. And they need to know because they're going to be the ones that are kind of bringing that vision to life. And then also, visual designers and copywriters are part of the stakeholders in the backend information architecture or content modeling, where copywriters can kind of like use all of the different types of content to kind of like inform their own spreadsheets of what they need to create and what needs to be updated maybe in the future. And then the designers can know and kind of like plan ahead for specific templates or components that would need to be redesigned that are kind of like being rethought through in this backend information architecture work. And a lot of the goals of a backend information architecture are again for like internal alignment, and they're usually done through like a platform redesign or a replatforming when you're moving from one type of CMS or like one tool to another. And then every tool has this like desire to use different terms, which causes a bit of problems. And you want to make sure that you are referring to things the same way and you're kind of like maintaining functionality that you want. And then also it helps with some of the like scaling content at scale aspects that some clients are specifically very interested in. So kind of like making sure that they have consistent content and they're not necessarily needing to update one thing in like multiple instances, because like the content modeling already has it set up so that some content pieces and like metadata is connected to one another and is updated automatically.
Wow, that's a lot to keep in mind. What what does your workflow look like when you come onto a new project?
Hmm. So since I'm on my own, at least for now, I've tried to create this like Notion doc where I have my little folders to have some specific kind of like processes or activities that I usually do on most projects, and then they differ, of course, depending on the client needs. But there are about, I want to say, 8 steps, and that I have broken down in the Notion doc. So the first one is before signing a project. The third is after signing, and for the purpose of this conversation, I'll focus like on the second once I've signed a project and it's starting. And those steps are initially interviews. So I will interview with the stakeholders on the project and just ask them about what they think is working, what they think isn't working, what they want to see in the future, and then interview users as well. Kind of similarly, and at this point, I might have like specific hypotheses of what I'm looking for if I've reviewed the app, or I might be looking for more open-ended questions, which I usually try to go like with specific questions and specific questions about related to us experience specifically. And the interviews are the two first components, and then the third. And again, like the timing kind of depends on a few things and how the project was sold and how the timeline is like more makes more sense for the client. But I will usually do an audit of the current experience, which kind of like looks like me manually reviewing the experience. So if it's an information architecture redesign, then I will be looking at specifically what a new user might interact with on their site. So kind of trying to find things, kind of trying to get an understanding of how they are grouping things on the site, how they're labeling things, if things are kind of like matching those principles that I was talking about earlier. And in this work, I'm usually working closely with someone on the analytics side from the client's team. So either someone from like the product analytics team, if it's an app, or someone on like the more web analytics part. So it can be something like Amplitude, but also Google Analytics or Hotjar for user recordings and heat maps to get a fuller picture of like what I'm seeing in the audit, which might be my perspective and kind of like based on those principles, but I want to make sure that it's like matching the data, or like getting the data to inform where I'm focusing on for the audit as well. And in the audit, I try to prioritize kind of like the main issues that I see by what might be like the more impactful things to focus on as we focus on the redesign in the next few steps. And the audit, again, I try to share it with the team members, like those stakeholders that I interviewed with in the beginning. So kind of like, here's what I heard from you, and then here's what I saw in the platform, to also give them an opportunity to kind of speak their mind about where I've focused on, and then also share with them the focus of the future work, because by this point I have not necessarily defined what I'm going to be redesigning from an information architecture. So it might be like the navigation, but it usually is also 3 to 4 of like the what I call the main experiences. Like for an app, that might be like the checkout experience or like the onboarding, and to have some of those identified both from the work with the analytics team, the audits, so kind of like reviewing what's not going well or like where there are opportunities for improvement. And then I have like a defined list of where I'm going to be focusing on and what I'm going to be redesigning. And then I'm sharing this like very low fidelity wireframes usually of like what the information structure is like. So it's not designed in the sense that you might think of with like actual visual design, but just the hierarchy of the information, and then how the information is kind of like matching some of those initial needs and goals that we've identified in the stakeholder interviews, user interviews, the analytics, and the audit. And then after this, there are a few things that differ. So I might also include that backend information architecture components, like the actual diagram if it's something that we've discussed previously with the client as well. So if they're very interested in like the internal component and ensuring like that scaling thing with the content types. So that's also something else that I will review with them. And for the front end information architecture, the thing that is user facing, I usually also will have a plan of like to content test it. So if there are specific things that either I had identified when they reached out to me and when we started the conversation, or if there were things that I identified during the audit or with analytics, and then we have these hypotheses of like the improved experience, but I want, whenever possible, to test it with real users, and I will usually give them. There are some very good tools now with like user research participant recruitment, and they will do it quite quickly and cost effectively, I would say. Sometimes the client has their own user base that they are willing to kind of like provide for more specific user testing. And then I will ask them if I have like specific tasks related to findability. So if there are these key user needs we've identified that I want the user to find easily, then I will give them the users the tasks of like find this, do this, and then they kind of like walk through during the test of why they're going to a specific place on the page or what they expected to see there. And it's always helpful, even if you've done all of like the discovery part with like the audit and the analytics. There are, of course, opportunities to sometimes miss context that the user might have. So some of those tests are very eye-opening, and then I incorporate those findings into the final design, so like the low fidelity wireframe designs. And then I also have this like deck with all of the work, since it's a lot, and I try to keep the deck under 10 pages. So even if it's like very senior stakeholders that may not have been involved in the day-to-day, but they just want to kind of like know what's happened with the project, what decisions were made, they have access in this like deck that's quite concise, but they have the opportunity to find like Miro or Figma files. I think those are all the steps. I hope I didn't miss anything. But usually it's something similar. And then yeah, there are other types of projects that I do that relate to content, but not necessarily are as specific about information architecture. So things like content style guides and like content design systems. So having rules for the user interface elements, so like buttons or specific components, kind of like what do you say, how do you say it, what are the words that you use, what are the words that you don't use. But these I would like put more on like the content design spectrum of my work rather than like information architecture. And usually I'm doing like more of the prior projects.
It sounds like a lot of your job is actually investigation and communication. That's really interesting.
It is a lot of investigation, and it's something I really enjoy. Kind of like finding those bits that are not working, because sometimes they're obvious if you look like deep enough, but sometimes they're really not. It's kind of hard to know unless you have like all of the pieces with the audit, the interviews, the analytics. So I definitely, it's something that I really enjoy improving and finding out.
What problems do you see manifesting over and over? Like, are there any commonalities, any kind of themes for information architecture issues you see between industries and customers and stuff?
Um, One of the main ones and the most common ones and the most frustrating ones to users is using internal language for
Mm,
user facing communications or work. So this will happen especially in like large corporations where you have all of these teams and this organizational charts, and every team has this. It's like when you ask your friend and you're like, what do you do again? Because they have this role that's a bit hard to understand. And a lot of companies fall, I've seen in this like trap where they will use some of those terms externally. So they will use them as ways to group their products or as filters for their services, and that is always confusing to someone who is not familiar with the terminology, because of course you're not familiar, you don't work with the company. And it's, again, I think not having specific dedicated people who are like thinking about the words, the terminology, what do we say and how do we say it. And it's frustrating to users because you're not really sure how to orient themselves, how to orient yourself within that ecosystem. So that's one of the main ones that I see quite a bit. And then groupings I see done not very well quite a bit as well. So kind of like the way that content offerings are grouped in some websites or apps is just not really matching how users are looking for things. And you will see this with like user recordings where they will go back and they will try different filters because they're not really finding the type of sorting or the type of grouping that they expect from their own mental models. So I see it a lot where there has not been this like work done to understand what the users' mental models are about searching specifically in this type of experience. But it has been decided in like a separate room, and then like the way that users search for information and the way that the information is set up within a screen is not matching, and this is creating like these issues where users are getting frustrated, and they may be also sending like tickets to support to kind of like understand what they're doing wrong or what they need to be doing. And those are information architecture issues, and in a lot of cases, and things that can be solved to a big to a big part with like these steps of like reviewing and analytics and talking to the people who use the product.
So what people probably don't know is that you have your own YouTube channel.
I
Tell me
do,
about
yeah.
that and how that got started, please.
Well, it got started as a desire for myself to challenge myself, because I am not very comfortable with public speaking, if you will. So writing has always been my preferred method of both learning and kind of like speaking. Writing about what I know has been one of like the ways that I also improve my own thinking. And so I have a weekly newsletter and I have a personal blog in my other secret life. Um, but it has always been writing, kind of like how I think and how I learn. And so sharing on video does not come naturally to me, but I know that, again, I think it comes back to kind of like information architecture and like content formats. So kind of like you have to think about the user's preferred um, way of consuming the content or the information, and whether you're like an app or, in my case, like a service provider. I'm trying to think of like different types of people that I might be able to help with my work, but they may not necessarily be interested in reading articles, so they might be more interested in like watching a video or like listening to a podcast. So I try to go with like the least amount of like resistance that I could find. So I did not want to have this like whole year planned ahead. I know that that would not work for like the YouTube channel. So I just wanted to get started. And part of what I have been doing is reviewing common information architectures of sites that a lot of us know, like Wikipedia or Ticketmaster, and kind of walking through their information architecture and breaking it down by like what they're doing on their homepage or their event page or a ticket page, and what they're doing, what it seems to be they're doing well, and what they might consider improving. Because also that's one of the ways that I like to learn, when I'm like seeing specific examples of something in action, and kind of like maybe things start to move around in my brain of like how actually information architecture is implemented in like an actual digital aspect, that someone may be starting their career or someone that may have been involved quite a bit in this field but not necessarily worked with an information architect might not know. But I'm very early on. I'm learning from the greats among us with the consistency and just doing some things better. But I'm also kind of trying to take it easy on myself and not be too hard on myself and just do what I can.
All right. Well, Technical Writing Uncensored people, there will be all sorts of links in the description if you want to check out more about Delfina and how to hear more about information architecture from her. And Delfina, thank you so much for joining me here on Technical Writing Uncensored.
It
And
was a
people
pleasure.
watching,
Thank you.
hey, people watching, if you enjoyed this content, please like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon. Maybe leave a comment. It really helps out with the algorithm. I will see you next time on Technical Writing Uncensored. Bye for now.